Okay. Hello, I'm Bas Hamer, and this is the first of the advanced tutorials for the Possum Labs DSL project. For all of the advanced tutorials, the same rule applies. Don't change these things unless you have a good use case for doing so. It's not going to be as easy to maintain in the long run because you are going to be overriding parts of the default behavior of the framework. Now you can do it. It's very extensible. It offers lots of options. But again, don't do this unless you have to. So let's take a quick look at what we have in store for the XPaths. So let's go to the tutorials and we'll go to the XPath one. And the interesting thing that we're doing here is we are switching out our custom our XpathProvider with a custom XpathProvider. So what's in the XpathProvider? So the XpathProvider includes the bits and pieces that are being used in the framework to create XPaths to find items. So for instance, there's a couple of things that we have to do when we are finding an element on a page. First of all, we have to match the text, right? So here we have a text match that both matches normalized space, so it removes any excess spaces, but it also matches the version where we add a colon at the end, right? So if you have a field called first name or you have a field called first name colon, now you can address it both with first name. This is the default implementation. You can do other things here. For instance, if you have an application that uses non-breaking white spaces, you can do replacements in here and do that type of things. Marker elements, this is places where it will look for text in the application. And content elements are, again, places where it will look for text, but it's a little bit more expansive because I believe it includes links and stuff like that as well. Yeah, that includes links. So when we actually go to the actual implementation, which we'll look at next, we'll take a look at what the total set looks like. But this gives you an idea of the different things you can replace. So when you see an XPath and it isn't able to find something because, for instance, you have like an article tag in your code, right? Which is something custom. It's not part of the HTML spec, but you want to be able to select it. Then you may have to include the article tag in one of these these XPath snippets. And that means you have to override those components. And then the way that it shows up in the actual application is as follows. If we go to the framework initialization, it's in here. We just register the custom XpathProvider as the XpathProvider. So that is how you can actually plug things into the framework. So a lot of the framework uses IOC, and a lot of the chunks in there have virtual methods to make it easy to inherit and override things. And in some cases, you can just add things as well. But for the XpathProvider, you're dealing with overrides. So let's go and take a peek at the original code for this. So we're now going over to the main code. This is not in the tutorial project. And we are going to take a look at web selectors. Actually, it might be, it's up here, XpathProvider. So here we are. So this is how it looks for different things, and you can see that there's all sorts of snippets. So here's the same snippet you saw before, which matches with or without a colon at the end, marker elements, content elements, active elements. So this would be like links, buttons, inputs, selects, text areas. By default, it will ignore things that are hidden, but it will include things that are hidden if it has a following sibling of role application. Right, so this is one of those cases where it will look for following sibling, which has a div of role applications. This would be like rich text editors and things like that that would be caught by this. This is still a feature that's in progress. Same thing here, except now this is checking for settable elements, which is different from active elements. So we exclude things like buttons and links, clickable things, selectable things, and checkable things. And these are the little components that are being used in creation of XPaths. So there's a couple of things that you can change in here, and here's some of the use cases. For instance, you have a style guide, and the style guide specifies that the only things that you're supporting are H1 to H3, so you don't want to check H4, 5, and 6. And you may say that like, hey, we don't support SAMP, code, strong, we have a very limited set of elements that are part of our style guide, so you can trim down these XPaths a lot. For instance, if you have a style guide that specifies, hey, every label for an input or something like that should have a colon at the end, well, then you just want to make sure you match this version and remove this guy. Or if you say there shouldn't be colons, you can of course remove this guy and create your own version and effectively validate part of your style guide as part of the test execution. Of course, your XPaths will also be a lot easier to read and work with because they're going to be a lot shorter. So a couple of things to keep in mind. One, this is going to change, right? As I learn more about different controls out there and expand the support, then things are going to show up. For instance, right now I'm working on the application part. So expect some of these things to change in the future. And that means that there's going to be somewhat of a maintenance component to this. So again, don't change these things unless you have a good reason to change these things. Yeah, I think that wraps up most of the XpathProvider part. We'll take a quick look at how some of these things are being used, so you have an idea as to where they end up and why switching out these little chunks will actually change the behavior of how the application finds elements. And let's take a look at active elements. Active elements is used in a bunch of places, but most of the times we just, let's take a look at this guy. So by label ancestor, this is one of the actual selectors, and right now we are in the selector factory. We'll have a separate advanced tutorial about this, but for instance, we pass in the active elements for settable selectors. And if we go take a peek at this, it doesn't look great in this particular format, but what you see is we start building the XPath out of its components, right? So we have a prefix, which is like for under or, for looking inside of error messages and things like that. That's what prefixes are being used for. It can be blank, of course. And then we start looking for the marker elements, and then we do the text match, and then we say, okay, well, we're going to go to the ancestor, which is a label, and then we are going to look for this element type, and the element type is the thing that's being passed in. Right, so what this looks like from an HTML perspective, we are looking at this kind of HTML, right? We have a label, which has a span and a strong, and then here's the piece of text we're looking for, and then we want to go find this input. And this is how we then create an XPath, and then this is how we create a selector that actually builds these XPaths out of its dynamic components. Okay, so this gives you a brief idea of what's going on and where these things plug in and how you can override things. And tutorials, you know where you have to override the default XpathProvider with this custom XpathProvider, and then in the custom XpathProvider you can override those little chunks, and then it flows through the entire framework. This does mean that you are going to have to create an override of the setup infrastructure, right? This is going to be true for pretty much all of these advanced tutorials, is you're going to be overriding the setup infrastructure method, and you're going to be tweaking things in there. So you're going to have to maintain a little bit more code, right? So you have about 50 lines of code here, and then you have this custom XpathProvider, which hopefully you'll just have to override one or two things. So another 50 lines of code here, and you've just changed how the thing works, and it can do all sorts of new tricks. If you find anything that you think should be supported by default and you're surprised that you have to customize for it, feel free to open a ticket and we might be able to just add it as a default support. The best way to open up tickets to get things supported without you having to customize things would be to take a quick look over at the implementation. And we're going to go to the tests. Integration test, features. So for instance, this is dealing with active elements. And if you can provide an example that looks like one of these scenarios, right? Specifically, here's an example that I think ought to be supported with an HTML snippet in there, then it's easy for me to add this in, add the test in, and then figure out how to best modify the XPaths to support the specific HTML pattern you're looking for. And down here you can actually see this particular example where we have this label with a span and a strong, and then here's the text we're looking for. We usually call this target in these test cases. And then we have the actual input, which also happens to be inside of a span in this case, and then that all lives inside of a label. So this is one of the ways you can structure your HTML. There are many, many, many ways to structure your HTML. Thank you very much for your attention. Let me know if these tutorials are useful. And I'll talk to you guys in the next one, where we're actually going to be talking about the selector factory.